Welcome, Mental Growth Network, and this is series of our podcast for mental health and neuroscience professionals, where we discuss various of topics related to business, technology, science, and today we have a special guest, which right now doing an amazing startup, which we will talk about later on, Jurij Dreo, and our podcast topic today is the future of psychiatry is a brain scan, AI-driven mental health diagnostics. Jurij is a co-founder and CTO at Brain Trip, and he is EEG and brain researcher. Hello, Jurij.
Hello there.
Can you tell us a bit more about yourself? What is your background related to mental health, related to neuroscience?
So I studied medicine. Now I'm the head of research at Brain Trip. I'm involved with developing new objective biomarkers of brain diseases and disorders, currently focusing mostly on neurology, but we're also dipping our toes into the psychiatric field, where we think the need is even more acute than neurology. And some people say this is more or less a joke in the field of neuroscience, but whenever a brain disease gets an objective biomarker, it's automatically reclassified from a psychiatric to a neurological disease. That's not quite the case, but in the past, it does seem to have been a factor. So traditionally, psychiatrists have dealt with diseases which were a bit less understood from a physiological perspective. And as soon as a disease or disorder was understood from a physiological perspective, the accusation, tongue-in-cheek accusation, was, of course, that the neurologist stole this disease from the psychiatrists, which is actually what happened with dementia. So back in the day, dementia was also a very mysterious disease, why certain people lost their ability to reason and their memory and their everyday sort of abilities. But as soon as we started developing objective biomarkers of dementia, the disease left the field of psychiatry and is now firmly entrenched in the field of neurology. And we're hoping to actually change that. We think that psychiatrists can benefit from objective biomarkers just as much as neurologists can.
Amazing. But like the first question that comes to mind is like, can a brain scan objectively diagnose something that, I don't know, today requires months of working with psychiatric interviews?
Well, the simple answer is yes, but there's a bit of a story to that as well. So there are many diseases that can present as a psychiatric disorder. Many diseases that are typically not classified as psychiatric diseases. Things like epilepsy. Certain forms of epilepsy present as being confused or having an attention disorder, or even perhaps being in a psychotic state. So these are all symptoms and conditions that traditionally fall within the domain of psychiatry. However, if you have epilepsy and you have certain abnormal electrical activity in the brain, this can present as these diseases, but is not amenable to traditional psychiatric treatment or even diagnostics. So even nowadays, if you do a standard EEG scan, and this is already done in clinical practice, you can detect whether or not a patient that seems to present as having delirium or psychosis or having an attention deficit actually has epilepsy. And it's been done for over 50 years, more than 50 years. So yeah, we can do certain brain scans. And to give you another example, let's say a PET scan, which is rarely done in psychiatric practice nowadays. The EEG scans are quite common because it's cheaper and less invasive, but the positron emission tomography scan is much more expensive. The device itself costs on the order of several million euros, whereas the EEG costs maybe a few tens of thousands of euros. But a PET scan can detect, let's say, conditions like frontotemporal dementia or the buildups of amyloid plaques in the brain, which are very definite signs of a neurodegenerative process, which can mimic certain psychiatric issues as well. So these scans can already be done, and you could conceivably think of a psychiatrist spending months trying to figure out what exactly is causing symptoms of attention deficit disorder, or perhaps symptoms of psychosis in a patient, but a simple EEG scan can reveal the underlying cause. Now, this is the simple yes that I spoke. This is what's already done. But there is a catch here. More or less any example that you can think of whereby we use an objective brain scan in today's clinical practice is an example where we do not confirm the presence of a psychiatric disease, but we rather exclude the presence of another disease that's not typically classified as a psychiatric disease. These are all of the examples that I gave you. So a psychiatrist might think, oh, this is perhaps somebody who has attention deficit disorder, but then EEG tells them, no, this is actually somebody who has absence seizures. Or a psychiatrist might think, oh, this is somebody who has perhaps delirium or psychosis. No, actually, this is somebody who has a brain infection, which can also be seen on certain EEG scans. So it's a case of excluding other diseases, not a case of confirming this underlying psychiatric disease. So most brain scans, probably all of them that are used in regular clinical practice in psychiatry, aren't confirmatory tests, aren't tests to confirm the presence of a specific psychiatric disease, but are cases of exclusion, excluding something that is not traditionally a psychiatric disease. But that's, just part of the story. It's as if an oncologist, so a doctor that deals with cancer, the only tests at their disposal were tests that told them, oh, the patient doesn't have cancer. Well, every now and then you also want to have a test that tells you whether or not the patient does have cancer. So this is what's missing from standard clinical use of brain scanning in psychiatry. Not to exclude other diseases, but to confirm psychiatric diseases. And that doesn't really exist currently in clinical practice.
Understand. But can you also, to help us navigate in this system, tell about some diseases that maybe you can't understand using the scanner, if you can think about some?
Well, from a clinical perspective, very few psychiatric diseases and disorders are currently clinically understood through objective brain scanning. Perhaps perhaps something like depression is beginning to change the field a bit, not necessarily in the field of diagnostics, but in the field of treatment efficacy. So depression is traditionally treated with antidepressants, can be also treated with other modalities, with cognitive behavioral therapy, with lifestyle changes and so on. But the pharmacological option has always been antidepressants. The problem with antidepressants is that there are a great number of them, a lot of different antidepressants, and the clinical trick is picking the right one for a particular patient. And the traditional pathway for that is just to try the antidepressant that seems to work most commonly in most patients, and then if it doesn't work, pick a second one, and if that doesn't work, pick a third one. But you have something like 10 potential antidepressants to choose from, and to figure out whether each of them works from a behavioral perspective, that is prescribing it and then waiting to see if there's an effect, that can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. It could take half a year. So if you want to cycle through 10 different antidepressants, and it takes months to figure out whether a single one of them works. It could take you years to cycle through all of the available options. That takes a lot of time, and it's not clinically very efficient. However, recently certain tests have come on the market, not necessarily brain scans, but genetic testing that can inform psychiatrists whether or not a certain antidepressant is more likely to work in a certain patient. So that's already being done in clinical practice. So instead of going through months of trial and error, trying to figure out from a behavioral interview, psychiatric sort of way, whether a treatment, an antidepressant treatment works, you can do a panel of genetic tests which can inform you and tell you, well, this one is probably not going to work, or is very unlikely to work for this patient, and that one is. And these tests work by typically taking a look at what enzymes are present in your liver from a genetic perspective. So basically, do you have the genetic code for certain enzymes in your liver? And these enzymes either break down certain chemicals or don't. And certain medication requires first to be broken down by certain enzymes in the liver, and certain other medication is the other way around. You don't want it to be broken down. So if you have the enzymes to break down certain chemicals, and those need to be broken down in order to be effective, then those antidepressants will work for you, and the other way around. If you don't have certain, if you do have certain enzymes, you don't want to prescribe certain treatments that those enzymes break down. So that's already being done. But that's a very rare example. For the vast majority of psychiatric diseases, even depression, anxiety, ADHD, mood disorders, psychosis, schizophrenia, for the vast majority of these diseases, there doesn't exist a clinically useful test to help a psychiatrist confirm a behavioral diagnosis. It does not exist in clinical practice outside, and this is the important, interesting point, outside of neuroscience research. And we can talk about that a bit later.
Very interesting. Now I want to switch a little bit closer to what you are doing, and in general, like the topic with nobody talk is AI. Yeah, so AI and neuroscience. How like really AI work if we talk about brain data? Like, can AI distinguish between like depression, burnout, trauma, neuroinflammation if he will use only brain data? How does it work in general? If you can talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so artificial intelligence and machine learning has had and is continuing to have and will have a tremendous, I think, positive benefit on medical practice. And that's because I think medicine is more or less the perfect field for the application of machine learning. So machine learning is extremely good at aggregating a lot of complicated, perhaps contradictory pieces of information into a likely outcome, into a likely conclusion, which is something humans are not very good at, to be quite honest. So if you have a simple algorithm, something like, if the concentration of blood glucose is above a certain cutoff, then you have diabetes. If it's below a certain cutoff, then you don't. So that's very simple to understand. You can understand it physiologically. You can understand why certain patients have high blood glucose, why certain don't. And it's reasonably easy to diagnose with a single test performed by a doctor, and there's not much complication there. But most psychiatric diseases aren't this way. Most psychiatric diseases, most brain diseases are a cornucopia of conflicting pieces of information that you try to make sense of. And the human mind is very good at making sense of certain pieces of information, particularly pieces that have to do a lot with your daily habits, and the way you talk and the way you look. Does your breath smell of alcohol when you're visiting the doctor? Are your eyes red? Are your hands shaking? So pieces of information that are very difficult to categorize and perhaps even take a note of. So the old saying is that let's say a good neurologist can diagnose Parkinson's disease before the patient has even taken a seat in their office, just by shaking your hands when you come in through the door, just by looking at you, the way you walk and the way you take a seat. So before you even said anything, the doctor already knows, oh, okay, this patient has a likely case of Parkinson's disease. And psychiatrists are very good at this as well. So even without asking any formal questions, even without really doing any biochemical tests, they're very good at narrowing down what seems to be the likely problem, just by talking to a patient, just by having you recite their day. And this is where psychiatrists are extremely powerful, with their human intuition, with their ability to know the way a certain society that the patient belongs in works. And AI is not going to change that or even improve that. But where AI can help psychiatrists is not by replacing this fundamentally important clinical observation. So trying to figure out whether your behavior, the way you talk, the way you smell, the way you seem to walk, whether this makes you unusual based on your socio-economical, societal stratification. But when a psychiatrist then orders a bunch of blood tests and a bunch of maybe brain scans, that's where AI can really help them sort through a mass of biological data that will always be conflicting. So when you order a blood panel and it gives you 20 parameters, and then one of these parameters might indicate you have a certain issue, but two other parameters might tell a different story. This is where the human brain is not very good at disentangling the very fine patterns that tell a story from the noise. And feeding 20 different numbers, 20 different parameters into a machine learning model that can then give hints to a psychiatrist. Perhaps a psychiatrist says, oh, I've spoken to this patient and my observation is that this might be a typical case of depression, right? Then the AI would say, well, I've taken a look at 120 blood biomarkers, and you know what? Their thyroid hormone levels seem to be a bit low. Not very low, and you might not have noticed that, but in conjunction with the anemia, with the low red blood cell count, and a bunch of other factors, this could also be an atypical case of hypothyroidism. So maybe their thyroid gland is not functioning at the peak of efficiency. While I know that that very severe decreases of thyroid hormone levels might cause depression symptoms, but this patient doesn't have severely depressed blood thyroid levels, but they also have a slight anemia and this and that and the other thing. And if you add up all of these 17 parameters, this could explain the psychiatric symptoms from a purely physiological perspective, and you should also investigate that, right? So that's where a fusion of machine learning and artificial intelligence helping a psychiatrist sort through dozens, hundreds of blood biomarkers could really help out. And it's also being investigated, and in certain instances is also being used. I've heard of quite a few cases of physicians doing double checks on their own, of the record, let's say, by uploading certain patients' anonymous, let's say, blood results into certain online AI models. This is not necessarily according to regulation currently, but a lot of doctors are doing this, not providing the patient details, the names and last names and so on, but just, uploading, and they say, oh, I've seen this patient and I think it's this. Can you go through these, a few dozen blood results and tell me if I'm missing something? So this is already being done, and this will be a tremendous benefit to doctors out there.
True. And if we talk about AI and using the AI of psychiatrists, can you also think about any risks, maybe where people can overtrust it, where they not should overtrust?
Oh, absolutely. That's always the case. The question of overtrust is always a function of how accurate the system is. So does an average mathematician overtrust their calculator? I don't think so. It's tough to overtrust your calculator because it's so incredibly accurate that, doubting the results of your digital calculator because there's a 1 in a billion chance that some kind of radiation from out of space flipped a bit in its circuitry and gave you the wrong result. It's technically possible, right? But going about your daily routine as a mathematician, when you're doing a lot of calculations, constantly having this in front of your mind, oh, maybe whatever I typed into the calculator is wrong, with a chance of 1 in a billion, because no, that wouldn't be productive, right? That would not be productive for a mathematician. AI for medical applications is definitely not there yet. So it might never be there. It might never be there. And it currently definitely isn't. So there is a wide area of being so impressed with what machine learning and AI can do currently that you forget that it also makes horrendous, idiotic mistakes. Mistakes that no human would ever do. This does not apply to calculators, by the way. A calculator never makes mistakes that no human ever does. But sophisticated machine learning algorithms, especially large language models, do. And for reasons nobody really understands currently. So medicine would not be well served in the year 2026 to overtrust large language models, to blindly trust very sophisticated machine learning tools like large language models with medical diagnostics without oversight. That would not be a good strategy, because we have no idea currently what biases, underlying errors, and so on can creep into the data. And that doesn't have, and we've not even spoken about the biases when it comes to data training. So, let's say you feed a machine learning algorithm a bunch of data, and it trains on this data and has a very high accuracy at predicting whatever outcome you want based on the training data. But then, then you apply it in clinical practice in a population where the genetic background, the race is different, the language is different, the propensity towards alcoholism is different, the climate is different, the time of year is different. So all kinds of differences creep in, and then you're likely to start making serious medical mistakes because the machine learning algorithm was trained on data that's simply not appropriate for whatever that you're doing. And this is just the most basic problem, the bias in the training data. So when it comes to applying sophisticated algorithms in medical practice for the year 2026, and I know that there are very optimistic people when it comes to these technologies out there. I am one of them, but I don't think I'm overly optimistic. Being overly optimistic is like saying, yeah, of course you should be skeptical today, but tomorrow all of these quirks will be ironed out and all of the algorithms will be so much more accurate than doctors are. It'll be as if mathematicians are doubting their calculators. perhaps, but we're not there yet. And it doesn't seem like we'll be getting there anytime soon. When it comes to, let's say soon, I mean in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Beyond 5 years, it's anyone's guess. Nobody can predict where we'll be in the year 2031. But nowadays, there's definitely a risk of patients and doctors being overly impressed with the accuracy and ability of artificial intelligence in certain areas, and then just blindly translating that trust into other areas where severe mistakes can be made.
And talking about the brain, the data that work best with AI, what types of brain data work best with AI, like EEG, fMRI, NIRSs, or wearables, or anything else?
So that's a very interesting question. So technically, as far as AI is concerned, the modality of the data, whether it be blood glucose level measured with a PET scan, whether it be changes in blood flow through the brain measured by a functional near-infrared spectrometer, whether it be electrical activity with EEG or structural changes with an MRI. As far as AI is concerned, it's just numbers. It's just numbers in vectors and matrices. It does not matter. The modality itself doesn't matter. What matters is, do these numbers contain information regarding the disease that you're interested in? And is this information specific enough? That's one consideration. Is the information there, and is the information specific enough? And I'll explain what this means in a bit. But the second important question is, can you collect enough of this kind of information in a reasonably affordable way? So these are the two important questions. Is the information in the modality, is it specific? And can you collect enough of it at a reasonable price? So certain kinds of information simply don't contain, certain kinds of data simply don't contain the information you want. If you do a structural scan of the brain, and your numbers are based on what's the volume of your prefrontal cortex, what's the ratio of the volume of the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex. So this is the kind of information you can get from a regular MRI. So you do a volume scan of your brain, and you can calculate the ratios of volumes and so on. Does this information correlate with whether or not somebody has depression? It does. There's a correlation there. It's published in the biomedical literature. The certain regions of your brain actually reduce in volume in severe cases of major depressive disorder. But the question is this information informative enough to really diagnose depression, to really diagnose it accurately enough, and to be specific enough? And what specificity? Well, specificity is the chances of making a false diagnosis in somebody who doesn't have the disease. So for depression, sadly, depression is far from the only disease that changes the volume of certain brain regions. Many other diseases do that as well, not psychiatric diseases, but all kinds of other diseases. And so diagnosing depression based on the volume of certain brain regions, based on MRI data, that just inherently seems to not have the information density applicable to depression. Can you collect enough of this information? Yeah, sure. You could collect sufficient, MRIs are reasonably cheap. They don't expose people to reasonably cheap. It costs a couple €100 to do an MRI scan, a structural MRI scan of the brain. It's not the cheapest thing you could do. And the device also costs about €1 million. But, in terms of medicine, it's doable. And there's literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of MRI scans available out there in the global internet, let's say. So, the data set is sufficiently large. So you could collect enough data, but probably not sufficient information density for depression. So these are the kinds of questions you should be asking, not necessarily the physiological modality, but does this modality have enough information for a disease, and can you collect enough data? So a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, people were really talking about multimodal strings of data from wearables. And by wearables, they didn't necessarily mean, gadgets that you specifically attach to your body, although that also fits the description. They were mostly thinking about your cell phone, because your cell phone is a multi-sensor platform that measures all kinds of things about your behavior, as we all know, right? Based on your behavior and how many steps you do a day, whether or not you're active at 3 a.m., right, on unpredictable days, your phone knows that. Whether or not you're active at 3 a.m. Are you scrolling through Instagram at 3 a.m.? That might not be terribly good for your mental state, right? And so your cell phone collects a tremendous amount of information about your behavior. Could this information be useful to predict whether or not you have a certain psychiatric or brain disease? Absolutely, it could, technically. Does it have the information density? Oh, yes, it does. It does. Can you imagine how much information there is? What types of posts do you like on your Instagram feed? What kind of people do you follow on TikTok? How many steps do you do a day? At what times of day? How often do you respond to the emails you get? Are you too depressed to respond to the emails, or do you respond in a timely manner? All kinds of, this is a treasure trove of information about your behavior. But there is a problem with this kind of information, and that it's very passing. It has a very high decay rate, as we like to call in the biomedical area. And by decay rate, what I mean is that apps change on a yearly basis. We were using Facebook 10 years ago. Now only particular segments of the population use Facebook. And 5 years ago, Instagram was still probably the undisputed champion of social media. Now it's TikTok probably. But for different people in different countries, it might be something else. So apps change constantly. And the content on these apps changes constantly, and who uses them changes constantly. So it's extremely difficult to build up a normative database on Instagram use to diagnose depression, because the people using Instagram today aren't the people who were using it 5 years ago. They've gotten older. And the young people don't seem to be using Instagram a lot. They use TikTok. But we don't have any normative data on TikTok because it's a new app. But by the time we get the normative data on TikTok to tie, the patterns of use of TikTok that correlate to depression, by the time you get that data, TikTok will no longer be used by anyone probably. So that's the problem. Your cell phone and the wearables you use do contain this tremendous untapped source of information, but medicine is worried that this information decays so rapidly and changes so rapidly that we'll never be able to build up a normative database on this kind of very high level behavioral data. So medicine likes to record something that doesn't change every 5 years, and what app you use and how you use it, that changes every 5 years. Medicine likes to focus on more physiological parameters. So things that are more constant, because it's based on how our bodies are built, not by our behavior. So that's probably more promising when it comes to these wearables. So how many steps you do will be a way more reliable predictor 10 years from now than what app you use, because that will change. But this number of steps you do hopefully won't, unless we develop new modes of transportation, which is always possible, but less likely than us developing new apps. So these, I think, are the questions you should be thinking about when you're deciding which brain modalities, which streams of information are a good candidate for brain diagnostics.
Very interesting. Thank you. I want to ask you a few more things before we will finish. Maybe we can switch a little bit about your product. What are you doing? What is the story behind your product? How did you start at it? What is the target audience? Tell us a bit more from your founding experience.
So BrainTrip is a company that does translational neuroscience. What that means is that we take well-established, highly replicated findings in the field of neuroscience, which is the science that deals with how our brains work, and we try and translate those basic science findings into practical, usable, clinical applications. Why are we doing this, right? Well, because there exists a tremendous gap between what neuroscientists do and can do and between what clinicians do in everyday medical practice. If you look at the neuroscience literature and search for biomarkers of depression and EEG, you will get about 1,000 hits for new papers, new discoveries, new biomarkers, new ways of diagnosing or figuring out something about depression based on EEG data every year. So every year, about 1,000 papers get published on EEG and depression. And the same applies to other mental psychiatric diseases and disorders as well. ADHD, anxiety, burnout, schizophrenia, anything under the sky. So thousands upon thousands of science papers get published every year, not just EEG, but MRI, fMRI, PET scans, all kinds of brain scans. So you could be led to think that science knows extremely well how to apply sophisticated analysis methods to these streams of data to diagnose these diseases. But then when you start talking to, psychiatrists, neurologists, so clinical people, you see that precious few of these scientific discoveries make it into clinical practice. If you ask a psychiatrist how often they use brain scanning to diagnose a particular disease, they will say almost never. Almost never. And when you ask them why is it that you don't? Well, say, well, I don't think you can, right? You can diagnose depression using an EEG, or you can't figure out which antidepressants will work using an fMRI scanner. I don't think you can do that. At least I've never seen it done in clinical practice. But how can you square that with publications publications in highly reputable journals with high impact factors, with prestigious institutions doing the research that say things like using advanced machine learning and EEG scans, we can diagnose major depression disorder with an accuracy of 92%. And there's hundreds of publications like this. So how do you square this disagreement between what's being done in practice and what's being done in a scientific sense? Well, we asked ourselves this question about 7 years ago. Why is this the case? Why is it when you go to a neuroscience conference, all of the neuroscientists say, well, of course, this can be done. Of course, we've been doing that for 30 years. But when you go to a clinical psychiatry conference, everyone's like, no, I've never done this. I've never seen this. This is odd. This is very odd, right? And our answers to this question have led to the company being founded and our first products being built. And the answers that we came up with are not connected with what can theoretically be done in a scientific sense, but basically what the laws of the universe permit you to do. This is the domain of science, right? So science deals with what the laws of nature let you do. And there's nothing in the laws of nature and physiology that says you can't diagnose depression with EEG. And, science has confirmed that. But we have engineering difficulties. So if you asked Isaac Newton in, the 18th century, whether there's something in the laws of physics that prevent humans from going to the moon? He would say, no, you just have to accelerate them to a sufficiently high velocity so they'll break free from the gravity of the Earth and they'll hit the moon. So you have to accelerate them sufficiently fast and, direct them in the right way, and they'll hit the moon. But then you ask Isaac Newton, so can you do that? And he'll say, no, absolutely not, right? There's no physical, technical way for us to get humans this fast. Probably the easiest way would be to shoot them out of a cannon, but that wouldn't be very practical. You'd probably kill them by the time they reach the moon. So while something might be possible from a scientific perspective, from a laws of nature perspective, it might not be technically feasible or practical. And that's the case for the vast majority of these neuroscience findings. While technically, while scientifically it's possible, it's not practically possible. Why? Because maybe the device is too expensive and psychiatrists can't afford it. Maybe the act of recording the brain data exposes people to radiation, and that's not good, right? Maybe the data you record is so complicated that you need to have a team of neuroscientists and PhD researchers and programmers spend 3 months analyzing the scan for a single subject, all kinds of technical difficulties. So we asked ourselves, which device is the cheapest, the least invasive, has the least technical difficulties, and where is the data easiest to analyze so we can bring it closest to clinical practice? And our answer is EEG. So EEG is our answer basically to how do we bring humans to the moon. And our answer is, let's build a rocket, because that's technically the easiest thing for us to do. Well, while theoretically somebody might say, but wouldn't it be better if we built a space elevator that takes people from the surface into orbit, and then wouldn't be, yes, that would be better. But I think it's not in our technical capabilities to build a space elevator just yet, right? So let's start by building rockets. And they are terribly inefficient. They have certain limitations, but let's start building rockets first. And once we have a moon base, then let's talk about building a space elevator. So more often than not, people ask us, oh, but why EEG? Whereas this modality has a higher resolution, that modality gives a nicer picture, or this modality can measure this. That's all true. But in our perspectives, you're talking about building space elevators when we're not even there building rockets and moon bases yet. So that's why EEG, because it's cheap, it's non-invasive, it's affordable, and the data it collects is easily amenable to modern AI-based analytics. So that's what we do. And that's why we decided to focus on EEG. And then we had to decide which disease to focus on first. And there's many diseases, but we decided to focus on early dementia detection. It's a disease that's between, you could say, psychiatry and neurology. It's a disease that afflicts many people, but it's also a disease that is very difficult to detect in its earliest stages. So that seemed like a good target. And our first EEG-based diagnostic is aimed at detecting early stage dementia. But the sky's the limit here. Dementia actually has diagnostic options, not in its earliest stages, but in later stages. But we have a wide field of psychiatric diseases, things we spoke about earlier: schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, ADHD, all kinds of diseases, which nowadays virtually have no objective brain-based biomarkers. And we hope to apply the methodology we developed, the machinery we developed, to these diseases as well. But now the moon is our closer target, right? Let's not target Mars before we hit the moon. So we decided to hit the moon first, which we did with dementia. But now we're looking forward to perhaps Mars and perhaps the asteroid belt as well. which is probably major depressive disorders and attention deficit disorders.
Thank you. Very interesting. So for those who are interested, under this video, you can check the link to Brain Trip and check this product more deeply. Due to our time is already finishing, last question. What advice can you give to mental health professionals exploring the world of brain scans?
Well, that's a very interesting question. My advice would be, which is always easy to say, to keep an open mind, try not to be intimidated by brain scanning and neuroscience. I think more often than not, we get a lot of resistance from certain segments of the mental health profession because they think we're trying to replace them by developing objective tools to aid in the diagnostics and treatment of certain diseases. This is not the case. This is as if a mathematician in 1950 were resentful of calculators because they do certain mathematical operations faster than they can. But calculators aren't competition for mathematicians. Calculators are a tool that mathematicians can use to be more effective. So my advice to mental health professionals is to embrace new technology, not to be afraid of it, to learn to use it to be more productive. Technology is an incredible labor-saving measure. It can help people if used correctly. There is a case to be made to be conservative when it comes to new technology. There always is a case to be made for that, but that will be handled by the regulators more efficiently than by individual practitioners. My hope is that individual practitioners will be open to trying out new things in clinical practice. To be open to new technologies, to be open to sometimes change the way they're doing things. And it's my hope that this will enable them to become better doctors, better psychiatrists, better neurologists. The way that, oncologists became better oncologists after they were able to detect tumors by doing a scan of the body, not just by trying to feel whether or not there's a tumor somewhere in the liver from the outside. That's a difficult undertaking. But if you can take a liver scan from the outside, then that makes you a better oncologist. It's our hope that the same will apply to mental health professionals.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting, and I am sure that our listeners will be very inspired, and maybe they will try a bit of brain scans in their work routine. And this was an MGN podcast with Jurij, Dreo and Yi Meandro. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.